Hello, universe. This is Rekha Nath. She was one of our speakers at the fall conference, but she was unable to participate fully because of an injury that she'd sustained at the time. So we're going to get a chance today to ask her questions about inequality that she would have had a chance to answer then, and we finally get to hear her input. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is different types of inequality. So we hear a lot of talk about inequality regarding income or wealth, the difference between the rich and the poor. But there's all kinds of other inequalities, and I want you to tell me about those.
Yeah. So I think that's exactly right. We find egalitarian complaints, that is, complaints about differences in how people fare, in what they have, and what they're able to do in a diverse range of domains. And so what I'm going to do is just talk about what I think some of the most pressing inequalities that we hear about today concern. So some of those inequalities, and here I'm going to be talking about ones that occur within American society. Some of the most important inequalities concern education. For instance, if you look at adults over the age of 25, a non-Hispanic white is nearly twice as likely to have attained a college degree compared to a Black individual. These inequalities in education tracking race start pretty early on. Studies revealed that Black students enter the first grade with lower reading and math skills than do their white counterparts and fall behind them in each subsequent grade that follows. In the K-12 system in the U.S., Black students are nearly twice as likely to drop out of school entirely, again, compared to their white counterparts. We also find significant disparities in the education system that track where a person lives, so the matter of just geographical happenstance. Students who live in wealthy communities tend to have a much better quality of education than those growing up in less economically advantageous areas. For instance, those in the wealthier communities have a lower student-to-teacher ratio, have much better access to technological resources, up-to-date computers and science equipment, more elective and AP courses offered, more and better extracurricular programs, and superior libraries and athletic facilities. These students, perhaps unsurprisingly, also have a higher rate of graduation and are much more likely to attend selective universities and colleges. Okay, so shifting to an entirely different domain, we find also that there are pretty significant disparities in health in our society. For instance, a Black child born in the U.S. today faces nearly double the infant mortality rate of a white baby. Blacks over a lifetime are many more times likely than are whites to die of AIDS, are twice as likely to die of diabetes, and have much higher rates of many conditions, including heart disease, cancer, and a range of other illnesses. Turning to another case yet, if we look at political representation, we find pretty serious disparities along both race and gender lines. So far fewer than half of the members of both houses of Congress in the US today, and these statistics are from 2015, are women. So over half the population are women, but just around 20% of Congress are women. And nearly 80% of our House representatives and 94% of our US senators are white, whereas in the general populace, non-Hispanic whites make up just 64% of the population. So putting aside, though, those who serve in political office, these disparities in political participation also can be found among the ordinary citizenry. So nationwide, if we look back to the 2012 presidential election, we found that Black voters waited in line to vote nearly twice as long on average as white voters. And due largely to felon disenfranchisement laws, nationwide, about 1 in 8 voting age Black men are ineligible to cast a vote. And in 3 states in the US, 1 in 5 African Americans are ineligible to vote. So these are just some of the different sorts of inequalities that we find in our political system. And then if we look at the workforce, we find that, and these statistics have remained constant for about the last 15 years, women make about 80 cents for each dollar that men make in the formal economy. And there are pretty significant disparities in the types of work that men and women do. The vast majority, for instance, of child caretakers, nurses, and secretaries are women, whereas the overwhelming majority of pilots, mechanical engineers, software engineers, and chief executives are men. The final domain that I think it's important to mention is the set of disparities we find in incarceration rates as well as subjection to violence. So in our society today, Black men are just about 11 times more likely than are white men to die of homicide. And Black men are imprisoned at a rate of 6.5 times that of white men. As we increasingly have attention brought to, particularly now with Black Lives Matter, there are significant disparities also in police treatment along racial lines. So one kind of fascinating statistic I just came across was that over an 8-year period from 2004 to 2012, the New York Police Department stopped 2.3 Black individuals and just under 500,000 whites. These were just routine stops to search for illegal contraband items like weapons and drugs. They found over that 8-year period an identical number of illegal possessions in white cars stopped that had white drivers and those with Black drivers. In each case, they made 16,000 seizures for each of those 2 racial groups, Blacks and whites. So what that means is that for each seizure that the police obtained, 143 Blacks were stopped compared to only 27 whites. Those statistics were ones that I came across in a recent illuminating lecture by the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson on race and mass incarceration in the US. For those kind of interested in racial disparities in general from a philosophical perspective, I'd strongly recommend her book, The Imperative of Integration. And on this issue of racial disparities in the criminal justice system, I think necessary reading is Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. But anyway, so those are just some of the various statistics concerning, at first glance, some pretty troublesome inequalities I think we find in our society.
Yeah. Well, okay, so there was a lot of inequalities there. I want you to convince us that they're troublesome, because not all inequalities are troublesome. In my class, for instance, at the end of the semester, there will be some students who I give A's and other students who I give substantially lower grades. And so that's an inequality. But it doesn't seem like it's an inequality that's bad. In fact, it's plausible that if all of my students got A's, you could say that there is actually something wrong with my class. So what's the difference between a case like that, where an inequality is, I think, pretty clearly fine, and inequalities that are not okay?
Yeah, good. So I try to resist the tendency to give a single reductive explanation of what separates those inequalities with which we take issue from those, like the one you just mentioned with the grade distribution, that seem perfectly acceptable. I think probably there are kind of a diverse set of considerations that explain why we find different sorts of inequalities problematic. So I'll talk about what some of those are. One reason I think we sometimes find extreme inequalities troubling has to do with the position of those who are worse off. And what we're troubled by in that case, I think, is that those who have less than others face hardships, that their absolute position is bad, quite separately of how they compare to others. And so I think we kind of saw some of this rationale for taking issue with inequality highlighted in the recent presidential campaign, in particular with Democratic nominee hopeful Bernie Sanders. So, as is pretty commonly known, inequality, and here I'm talking about income and wealth inequality, in the US has grown pretty significantly in the last 40 or so years. And over that period of time, most of the gains in economic growth have gone to those at the very top of the distribution of income and wealth, while the position of those at the bottom has remained about the same. And when we ask, is this a bad thing? One of the things that Sanders and many others have drawn attention to is the fact that so many people in our nation are struggling to get by. Based on just the actual federal poverty threshold measure that's used, approximately 1 in 5 children today live in poverty. And that official measure has been criticized as underestimating how much a household needs to actually get by and satisfy their basic needs. And using a standard that takes into consideration what those basic needs consist of, estimates are that 44% of children in the US today live in low-income families. So what are we talking about tangibly when we talk about the problematic material effects here? Well, some of it has to do with access to a nutritionally adequate diet. Many poor individuals in our society are unable to meet their food needs adequately. Either it means that they're not able to get enough food, or in many cases, the food that they're able to get access to affordably is of a pretty low quality. Another problem is that many Americans are unable to secure affordable housing, as housing prices have been rising and incomes have stayed about the same at the lower end of the spectrum. So in these sorts of cases, what is bad about the inequality, I think, isn't really the gap per se between the well-off and the less fortunate, but it's that some are doing so much better to others, and we have the thought that given how bad the position of those at the bottom is, we could redistribute or find ways to make those gains in economic growth be shared more evenly across different members of society. So I think that sort of reason isn't about the badness of inequality per se. Now, a different reason that's often kind of discussed today about objecting to material inequalities concerns the way in which economic inequalities translate into greater political influence of the well-off. And the reason I think this is something we increasingly talk about is that we had a pretty fundamental shift in political campaign contributions in the Supreme Court case Citizens United in 2010. And we have really only just now started to see some of the material effects of that in the most recent election. So to give you one sort of example of how money is able to influence the political process in the US, based on an investigation of the first stage of this past presidential election, in that initial stage, just 158 families contributed $176 million to support the campaigns of Republican and Democrat hopefuls. So we're talking about households that are each contributing on average upward of $1 million. And something that's really difficult to measure is how much that political influence might translate into favorable policy representation for the wealthy. But even putting aside that worry, it seems clear that when wealthy individuals are able to contribute in such great quantities to political campaigns, that they have much greater influence than your ordinary American in determining who can actually run a successful campaign and who probabilistically is likely to get voted into political office. Now, like the previous reason, the humanitarian reason for objecting to inequality, this rationale too doesn't get us at a problem with the fact that people fare differently in material terms. It concerns a contingent effect of that inequality, which is something that depends on how our society decides to allow or and regulate the ability of money to translate into political power. So there's one kind of final reason of, I think, many reasons we could point to as to why we might find inequalities problematic. And that has to do with the ways in which differences between people can result in treating those who have less or who are seen as being different in some sense as being treated or perceived as inferior to others. So the idea here is that inequalities can translate into stigmatizing differences in status, as some put it. So one of the kind of classic examples that's discussed with this sort of rationale for objecting to inequality comes from Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations, written a few hundred years ago, in which he talks about the fact that an individual in English society at his time would be required to have a certain sort of attire, a linen shirt, to be able to appear in public without shame. And the idea is that we might object to economic or other material inequalities between people that result in some people being able to afford the sort of dress to be able to meet these basic societal standards so that they would be subjected to humiliation or retreat from public engagement with others because of this disparity in how they fare. Now, we can look at some kind of give this a contemporary gloss and ask what sort of inequalities of the ones that I mentioned a little earlier might be objectionable based on this sort of reasoning. So if we return to the some of the gender inequalities I mentioned, like the low representation of women in political office or the disparity in women holding kind of positions of leadership in the workforce, like being CEOs, we might think that these sorts of disparities work to reinforce stigmatizing differences in status between the genders, perhaps perpetuating the stereotype of women as lacking in leaderships compared to their male counterparts. Or, for instance, if we take kind of the shockingly high rate of incarceration of African American men in the US compared to other demographics in our country, it seems highly plausible that this inequality in turn fuels the stereotype of Black men being regarded as violent and dangerous and deviant. And the sort of material inequality then in who is locked up to what degree has the effect of influencing the social standing of this entire group of individuals.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so there's a different kind of concern now. Let's say we have this value in our society based on all these reasons you've just been giving us. We realize we're very unequal and we want to be more equal than we are. There is a kind of tension then between equality and liberty. So we're going to have to constrain people's activities in certain ways to try to make sure that these equalities don't arise. And, you know, if you think about the identity of like the American political system, you might think that liberty is actually the more fundamental one. But you know, that's kind of a curious fact about the United States. But even in general, just what do you think the relationship is between liberty and equality? When might it be a good idea to constrain people's liberties in order to pursue more equality?
Yeah. So I think this is like often taken to be one of the most serious clashes in values that political philosophers are to contend with. And part of what I think about this issue is that sometimes the conflict between liberty and equality tends to, upon examination, be illusory or not be as great as we might initially think. So take one of the classic cases where political philosophers of the libertarian stripe object to initiatives to promote equality on the basis of the infringements to liberty that are implied by them.
Yeah.
So a classic libertarian like Robert Nozick says that the problem with an egalitarian redistributive program taken on by the state is that it necessarily involves interfering with people's free choices. We allow people in the laissez-faire market to make exchanges. Some people, famous athletes, celebrities, entrepreneurs, get pretty wealthy because of the skills they have, and then these inequalities arise, and to address them, the state has to swoop in at regular intervals, maybe through annual taxation, take away from the rich and forcibly against their wills and give to others, those who have less than them.
Can I jump in real quick? Because there's another case that I'd be interested to hear you kind of consider as you're talking about this. So say that there's an employer who has a range of employees, paying them a certain amount of money, maybe paying the minimum wage. And then the minimum wage goes up. And when that happens, the employer can no longer keep all of the previous employees because the cost of labor just went up. And so this seems like a situation in which the laborers themselves are being harmed in the sense that they no longer have the liberty to work for this employer for this lesser wage, which they might be willing to do.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's a little bit different than the case of taking the wealth away from the people who've earned it in the laissez-faire market. So.
Yeah, good. So, the idea is that when the government does something like set the basic minimum wage, it can lead to some people being prevented from entering into otherwise voluntary contracts that they would like to enter into, both as employees and on the other side as employers. And so, I think I have kind of a general response that addresses that case as well as the government redistribution one, which is that if we take a broader view of what happens in the counterfactual if we don't have this sort of government interference, either engaging in socioeconomic redistribution or in barring people from working below a certain minimum wage level, what happens is that, we know kind of predictably that what we can expect to happen is that some people will be working pretty horrible jobs for extremely low wages. Some people, if they aren't able to get access to government benefits, might go through periods where they're unable to meet their housing or nutritional needs. They may be homeless or starving in the extreme cases. And in these instances, I think we want to say, looking at the social system as a whole, that it is those individuals' freedom is importantly constrained in that the things they are able to do, being able to carry out some of their most rudimentary wishes, to raise their family, to have a roof over their heads, to have sufficient food, are unable to be met. So the range of options they have might be between taking one terrible job or another, or in some cases, no options for employment at all. Mm-hmm. And so I think those are kind of a different sort of way in which we can see that a highly unequal society can undermine the freedom of, in particular, those who have less than others.
Okay, so just if I try to recap specifically the minimum wage case, the idea is that if we look at this particular fictitious company I described, you could see there's this negative effect. But if you take a bigger picture over the whole society, minimum wage laws look like they have positive effects, and maybe this is kind of an adjustment period, and that after a period of time, the jobs and the wages will shift around in a way that that hopefully, all things considered, people are going to be doing better.
Yeah, and I won't take a clear stance on the empirical issue because it's one of the questions that economists tend to disagree about, that they're almost split right down the middle about, concerning the overarching effects of a minimum wage policy. And one of the difficulties in measuring it is that there's a lot of variance jurisdiction to jurisdiction about other social effects and laws that make it hard to sometimes isolate the effects just of raising the minimum wage. But the idea is that if we conditionally accept the idea that some workers will be considerably better off at making a greater minimum wage than there would be if there wasn't one set by the government, even if there's the trade-off that we might have slightly higher unemployment, then I think, there's the argument that if we look at how all individuals in our society are affected by the policy, plausibly freedom is promoted overall by a greater proportion of the populace being able to do things they want to do, which is one way to look at freedom. And how we define freedom itself is something that there's probably going to be substantive disagreement about.
Yeah, good. So regardless of what the best policies are having to do with minimum wage, your point is that this economic and other types of inequalities actually do end up constraining people's liberties.
Yeah, exactly right.
One more thing that we should talk about before we sign off. Everything we've talked about, it seems like we're kind of assuming a U.S. or developed world context. And of course, there's equalities of different kinds globally across nations. And I wanted to hear you make a few comments about that.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. And I think in a lot of discussions, both in philosophy as well as a number of other disciplines in the social sciences, discussions about inequalities focus on inequalities within within a country between fellow citizens. And of course, there are important and in many cases kind of much greater inequalities that we find on a global scale. So I'll start off by just naming or by pointing to a few statistics about some of the relevant global inequalities that obtain in today's world, and then we can talk a little bit about what basis there is perhaps for taking issue with them. So according to a recent, I think a 2015 Oxfam report, the richest 1% of individuals worldwide now have more wealth than the remaining 99% of the global population combined. Global inequality now in wealth, again, is greater than it has been in any time since the 19th century. The combined wealth of the world's richest 62 individuals is equivalent to the wealth held by the poorest 50% of humanity. There are different ways we can measure global economic inequality, but one way is to measure the gap between the richest and the poorest countries, looking at the country's per capita incomes. And if we compare how we're doing now compared to 50 years ago, around the end of colonialism being practiced on a pretty wide scale worldwide, people living in the world's richest country back then in 1960 were 33 times richer than people living in the poorest nations. Now, that disparity is that people living in the world's richest nation are 134 times wealthier than the average income of those in the poorest nation. Okay, so there are these kind of massive income inequalities on a global scale compared to the economic inequalities we find in a society like the US, which for a developed country is pretty inegalitarian. But there's a question from a moral perspective as to whether the same sorts of considerations that lead us to find inequalities objectionable within our state borders also apply on a global scale when we are talking about inequalities between individuals who do not share a political society. And to answer this sort of question, we can, I think, recall some of the main considerations we were talking about why inequalities within our society are problematic, and ask about their application globally. So the first reason we talked about concerned humanitarian, the humanitarian concern we might have for those who are at the very bottom of the spectrum. And here I think we have a clear case for being disturbed by global inequality if we look at the position of the world's worst off. So looking at fairly recent World Bank data on global poverty, of a population worldwide of about 7 billion, about 3 billion individuals live on less than $2.50 a day. And that's $2.50 measured, accounting for differences in what currencies will translate to in a different country. Sorry, let me put that a little differently. That sort of economic measure is adjusted to reflect what $2.50, for instance, would buy in the US in terms of the goods and services one could get by living on that much per day. And moreover, if we look at what that economic position implies in real terms, hundreds of millions of people worldwide live without access to adequate shelter, without access to safe drinking water, and with no access to even the most basic health services. So we might object, and I think we should object, to global inequality insofar as we think that some of the great gains at the top going to the wealthiest countries could be used to support programs that would benefit the lives of the world's worst off. And here we're not just talking about a global redistribution of income and wealth, but the investment in programs that address a range of complicated issues that would seek to improve the lives of the poorest. I think we find something, similar analogs if we look at the ways in which economic inequalities on a global scale can translate into uneven political influence. So if we look at some of the key economic institutions that regulate global interaction, like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, we find that a country's economic position translates almost perfectly into its voting power in those institutions. So, for example, 40% of the world's poorest individuals together exercise 10% of the IMF's voting power. And the flip side of that is individuals living in just 10% of the global population live in countries that together exercise nearly 45% of the vote in the International Monetary Fund. So I don't think it's much of a stretch looking at these and some other global institutions to say that we have something like a global plutocracy. And insofar as we are troubled by a translation of economic position into political power on a national level, I think we have real questions to ask about whether there is a significant difference between global relations that would make the translation there of uneven political power less problematic. Okay, so The final kind of consideration about why we might object to inequalities that we talked about that I think poses a pretty interesting case in examining global inequality concerns the stigmatizing effects on people's social status that material inequalities can translate into. And one, I think, initial reaction a lot of people might have about this consideration is that we don't really have anything like a global society that's anything like the sort of society we have within national borders. So unlike individuals who share a state, it might be pointed out that foreigners don't tend to share a common identity, don't share a common language or culture, that there's no global membership equivalent to citizenship, that whereas members of a state participate in a common political system, interact as neighbors, in schools, in the workplace, that foreigners don't, by and large, interact in these ways. And so, based on those differences, it might just seem that we can't really make sense of inequalities between foreigners having a stigmatizing effect on people's status vis-a-vis one another, because it doesn't seem we have a shared sense of status at all. Now, I think it's important that we do grant that there are these clear differences that obtain between the interaction and the sort of relationship we find between fellow citizens on one hand and between foreigners on the other. But I think it's also worth noting that we find important parallels between the two cases in an increasingly globalized world. So I think if we look more carefully, we see that there are important ways in which foreigners act that do reflect social hierarchies that might seem troubling. So one case, I think, in which we can see this is if we look at trends in global migration. So just last year, there were a total of about 240 million individuals worldwide living outside of their country of birth. And if we look at the way in which immigrants, or many immigrants, are treated and regarded by native-born citizens in the countries in which they take up residence, there are some pretty disturbing trends. Immigrants often are subject to violence and distrust and are subjected to all sorts of negative stereotypes in the countries in which they move to. We can witness this, I think, in the recent presidential election and campaign, in which repeatedly Donald Trump made hateful and ignorant comments about Mexican immigrants in particular, portraying them as being comprised largely of violent criminals, drug dealers, and rapists. And this was a sentiment that the American populace, or segments of it, embraced. And that, I think, is very troublesome. Immigrants often find themselves effectively ghettoized, living in separate neighborhoods or being segregated in the workforce from others in the societies in which they live. And they're often demeaned or marginalized based on their actual or sometimes perceived cultural values. And so I think these sorts of interactions show us that there can be kind of problematic inequalities on a social level that arise between individuals regardless of having shared citizenship. And I think we're going to have to contend with this increasingly as we're coming to see one of the largest refugee crises that we've faced in our time, with nearly now about 5 million Syrians in just the last 3 years having left their country and sought refuge elsewhere. But I don't think it's just face-to-face interaction between foreigners that has the potential to create stigmatizing and problematic differences in status. We relate to individuals worldwide through complex transnational labor chains, through a globalized economy, through an interdependent trade network, in having to address shared problems like climate change and the spread of communicable diseases, through the imposition and the need for shared property rights regulations, regulating the ownership of natural resources, of intellectual property, and being jointly subject to these different rules, shared norms and practices means that I think increasingly individuals from different parts of the world can be seen to share a sense of mutual identity and come to define themselves in relation to one another. And I think it's significant that these relations, these forms of interaction we have, are unavoidable. They're not something that we can just retreat from and adopt isolationist national policies. And so, given the fact that we must and we will continue to interact in important ways with people outside of our countries, the moral question is not whether we interact, but rather upon what terms that interaction is predicated. And we face a choice as to whether we wish to continue upholding these social hierarchies that create, I think, effectively a class of a global underclass, or whether we seek to find ways to meaningfully forge our relationships with foreigners on more egalitarian terms.
That's great. So that was supposed to be the last question, but I realized there was something else that I thought it might be fun to throw out and hear your input on. So I've been thinking for a while about how monetary wealth doesn't actually matter, morally speaking. What does matter is something like happiness or well-being or flourishing, or right. And if it turned out that wealth correlates with happiness, then it would matter. But as it turns out, it doesn't. I mean, there's a pretty tight correlation to begin with, right? So if you have very little access to wealth, things will go very badly for you. Your life will not be going well. But that curve is, it's one of these like, I don't know, it levels off.
Around like $80,000 if you look at the U.S.
Good. So when I try to explain this to students, I just like, let's pick a nice even number. Let's just go with $100,000. So here's a claim that I think is not crazy. At $100,000, any wealth beyond that is no longer contributing to your happiness. You have as much wealth as it takes to live as happily as a human can live. That's not saying you are living as happily as a human can live. But if you're not, it's for reasons other than access to wealth, right? And it's pretty easy to pitch this. You just say, here's a person, they're making 100K. Here's another person, they're making 200K. Does this seem at all plausible to you that the second person is twice as happy as the first person? And everyone will immediately say no, right? And that's just at 200K, which when we start talking about these, 60-something wealthiest people on the planet, they're so far beyond that it's not even really possible for us to process that kind of a number. Like, once we get into billions and billions of dollars, ordinary people, actually probably not even wealthy people, have a real deep grasp of what that kind of money is, what that kind of wealth. Certainly not ordinary non-wealthy folk. So all this to say, I find this to be a pretty compelling concern about very large inequalities, because it's not plausible to suggest that people past a certain threshold are benefiting at all by the wealth that they have. In which case, I know that taking things away from people can harm just in and of itself, right? If you have something that you don't need and someone takes it from you, that is a kind of harm. But it's not crazy to think that you could take away, that wealth could somehow be redistributed from these very, very, very wealthy people to a lot of people who are living below the sort of minimum threshold to even have basic choices about how they live their lives and things like that. You could remove a lot of that and not hurt the wealthy people at all, not make them any less happy than they are now. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I don't know. Say something about that.
Okay. So first of all, just on the facts, I just want to say that the richer we get, even beyond that kind of level at which the curve seems to flatten, the richer we get, there is still a correlation with being happier, so that the super wealthy do tend to be somewhat happier than the less well off.
Mm-hmm.
But right, the idea of diminishing marginal utility is that the gains in happiness are pretty small at that level, and if we transferred some of their wealth to those who have much less, there'd be a much greater absolute gain correlated with that transfer. So there are some like happiness losses, but like if we take the general point, I think you're right that we could make many people happier by having a massive economic redistribution. And the question, I take it, is this something we should do, given that what ultimately seems to matter is people's well-being or happiness and not money itself? Well, I think there's a few further issues we have to ask to work out like what the correct answer to that question is. So one of them is to what extent is the overall size of the economic pie we have to take from going to be affected by those sorts of transfers? So if we right now were to take a large chunk away from the very wealthy, does that mean that people who are making lots of money will in the future be less inclined to invest hard work or develop the sorts of entrepreneurial the sorts of innovative ideas I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Those sorts of things. Whether they are going to be able to do those, whether they are as likely to do those things without the economic reward. If not, then there's a problem that over time we have less money overall to use to benefit all members of society. So that's one worry. And almost all evidence I have come across is showing us that we are not right now at the level of redistribution where we're taking away from those at the top and giving to those at the bottom, where we are anywhere close to threatening the gains that would optimally benefit those at the bottom. Mm-hmm. So there probably is, right, some wisdom here to an idea supported by proponents of trickle-down economics, but we could do a lot more redistributing while promoting happiness than we do now. But the other kind of more philosophically interesting question, I think, is whether there is something else that's objectionable about such a redistribution that doesn't have to do with compromising the happiness of those we're taking away with. So I think here we get to something closer to the consideration of liberty or freedom that we were talking about earlier. So even if it's not making someone happy, do they nevertheless, should they be given the freedom to make as much as they want, or how much should they be able to make regardless of the effects that those economic gains have on their kind of well-being, maybe measure in terms of happiness? And here, I think there's at least an argument that it doesn't all just come down to happiness. I'm not a utilitarian myself, so I think we'd have to kind of carefully examine the reasons for how we want to set up a cooperative system in general and what count as good reasons for people to be able to make gains in the first place. But I think arguably there could be good reasons for people being able to keep wealth even if it's not making them happier.
Great. I thought this has been fun, Rekha.
Yeah, me too.
All right. I'm going to officially say goodbye, and we'll post this on the web soon for people to see.